Hazel Irene Drew died in 1908, July, right after the July 4th weekend. And her murder has remained unsolved until the present day. And Mark Frost, who's the guy who really wrote the scripts for Twin Peaks, we all credit David Lynch with the series, but Mark actually wrote them. Uh, his grandmother lived in Troy, which is where Lisa lives, and he wrote the series basing Laura Palmer on Hazel Drew. So everything you know about Twin Peaks, flash forward to Hazel Drew's story. And this is an excerpt from a chapter, the most Twin Peaks chapter in the book. So I'm not going to tell you who the killer is. That wouldn't be fun. You have to wait to find out who did it. There was about 6 inches of snow on the ground when Eliza and I pulled my BMW up to the cemetery. It was a cold upstate February, hovering well below freezing, the sky filled with steel gray clouds. The snow had been on the ground for days and was hard packed and frozen. Even in good boots, walking around the untrodden cemetery was difficult. We had no idea where the Drew family plot was located. We had seen photos of it online taken in summer, but with no information about its location, it would be a challenge to find. After an hour, I was feeling cold, and having stayed up almost all night putting together furniture for her new house, I was getting hungry and grouchy. My friend had given up the search and made her way to the biggest landmark at the cemetery, a gigantic native oak around which there was no snowpack. I wandered over to the tree, hoping to collect her and make our way to a diner for some food and hot coffee. I was ready to give up on the case, some detective. I couldn't even find a grave in a cemetery. This tree is weird, my friend said with a faraway look in her eyes. I was afraid the stress of staying up all night and home buying was getting to her. I touched it, and now my hand feels like it was electrocuted, she said, shaking it out and staring at her hand like it was no longer a part of her body. It's a creepy old tree, and it's unusually warm under here, I said as I approached it. I shouldn't have touched it, Eliza said, looking again at her hand. With the chill blowing and the clouds hanging low, the whole atmosphere got heavy like kids playing with a Ouija board, and nobody will admit to moving the planchette. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't. It was as if something was calling me, summoning me to the strange tree. I walked around to the opposite side she had touched and laid my hand on the tree's ancient, gnarled bark. I didn't feel a shock, but I immediately started to feel queasy. My first thought was the sleeplessness and excitement had me pumping too much cortisol. Holy shit, I thought to myself, I'm pushing 50. Is this a fucking heart attack? My world started to spin, and I could feel the little bit of food and coffee I had in my guts churning and churning harder still. I was getting dizzy. I had to get away from that witch tree and maybe even get myself to a hospital. I hoped like hell that Eliza could drive my car. An ambulance wouldn't find us out here. I started walking, then staggering like I was about 9 shots of whiskey deep. The whole world was spinning. Finally, pouring cold sweat in that frozen landscape, my stomach gave up and I puked pure liquid on the snow. I could see my friend's silhouette just staring back at me, unmoving. I kept pushing myself towards the car, but I had lost the path. I was facing the wrong way now, and I realized I was simply not going to make it. The ground rose up to meet me, and I fell down, landing on my knees. Getting on the ground, I caught my breath and managed to slow the spinning. My ungloved hands were resting on something cold and hard, and I looked down to see a single word carved in bone white marble: Hazel. I found it, I whimpered out, and my friend came running, whatever spell she was under broken. Oh shit, there it is. We were looking for an hour, and there it is. Wait, are you okay? In fact, I was okay. Whatever spell I was under was also broken. My now empty stomach was still churning, but my breathing was normal, and the world was no longer spinning. I looked back at the path I had taken, initially heading for my car, but after vomiting, paradoxically taking a sharp turn to the right and collapsing on Hazel Drew's tombstone. Out of the hundreds of graves, I landed on her exact stone. What were the odds? I was finally standing upright as Eliza approached the grave. This was the moment things took a turn from strange to outright spooky. Her eyes grew wide. I asked what was wrong. She said she felt a tapping at the back of her head and was hearing a woman's voice yelling repeatedly, like this, as she floated behind her on the way to the grave. She described seeing a version of the murder as if from inside the body of Hazel Drew. I was simultaneously seeing the event from a bird's eye view. That was strange enough, but both our spines ran up and down with cold chills when we suddenly saw a well-dressed man in a loose-fitting spring suit approaching, smiling. Did you just hear a man speak? My friend asked, wide-eyed. Yes, I replied, flabbergasted. He said, hello, beautiful. I told her, barely believing the words coming out of my mouth. My friend nodded, speechless. Thoroughly shaken, we snapped pictures of the area, including the path I followed to the grave. My footprints visible in the snow, collected ourselves, speaking few words, then drove in almost total silence to the closest diner. I ordered coffee, water, and a plate of eggplant, my favorite comfort food. That was good, though. It was clear I wasn't going to die. We were both in a stupor and sat in our booth, jackets still on, fiddling with menus and taking anxious sips of water, waiting on the coffee. Out of the blue, the murmuring cacophony of the restaurant was broken when a waitress passing by asked out loud, is Hazel coming? Did you just hear that waitress ask? Is Hazel coming? She asked me, her wide eyes wild again. Yes, I heard it too, I replied, feeling thoroughly spooked and confused. We were no longer in the graveyard. We were in a normal diner, surrounded by the living, breathing, eating, and drinking and talking, all of them seemingly oblivious of the clairaudient manifestation we had just experienced. What's happening? Eliza asked. How is that possible? I didn't have an answer. Frankly, I still don't know what happened. Eliza and I continued to talk about that day just to remind ourselves that it wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was how we first met Hazel Irene Drew. That was only the beginning of the strangeness investigating this long dormant cold case. Hazel was ready to reopen the files with our help. She spoke, we heard her, and could not ignore the story of a young woman robbed not only of her life, but of her legacy. When I began this investigation, I never had an expectation that any aspect of it would in any way be reminiscent of the Twin Peaks universe beyond the initial conceit that Hazel Drew was the inspiration for Laura Palmer. David Lynch took as his muse the land and quirky people of Washington State and the wider Pacific Northwest where he grew up. However, it quickly became apparent that the native and colonial lore of upstate New York, especially the ancient and sacred site of Saratoga Springs, and the land centering on Troy is, arguably, the closest thing one may ever find to the real Twin Peaks.